I will never forget the occasion. It was a Sunday. Our family had just had lunch together after a church meeting. I was maybe 11 years old, and I have two younger brothers. One of them had already left the house to play with a friend in this housing area we lived. And we were finishing lunch when we heard from our neighbor's house, my youngest brother, who was maybe 4 or 5, shouting from the backyard, "Help! Help!" Of course, I finished enjoying my lunch. And afterwards, immediately we stood up. My other brother and I ran to the neighbor's house and noticed the side door was open. There wasn't anyone home. My brother was on the backyard by the swimming pool, and his good friend, who was also around 4, had fallen in the swimming pool, and he was drowning. There was no one, so he was shouting for help. Allow me to pause the story, and I'll come back to it towards the end of my presentation. I want to make sure you are all awake. Mainly the Spaniards are not tempted to have a siesta at the moment, but it is related to our conversation. And I wonder if it happens to me often, every time I speak into a group like this moment, or teaching or preaching, there is this stomachache or sweating hands, and even an inner struggle and pressure and even apathy that I personally feel just minutes before communicating God's word, which, by the way, with time I've come to the conclusion it has to do with spiritual battle. But particularly I see those symptoms increasing when I know that in that group or in that gathering there are people who aren't yet followers of Christ, non-Christians. And therefore, my invitation to us in the next few minutes that we have together is, as we think of our communication of biblical content, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you, which by no means are definitive ways of communicating, but I do hope they will be of benefit to all of us and generate a thought-provoking and relevant conversation for us as Christian communicators across Europe. You may be a preacher, like myself, or a teacher, a writer, an artist, social media content creator, all of us who transmit biblical content in different ways, through sermons, poems, songs, video, classes, articles. But more specifically, for this session, I've been asked to think together about the communication of biblical content in the gathering of Christians. Even more specifically, consider our communication, the message that we are sharing in, for example, church services or church gatherings, or even youth groups or Bible study meetings. I'm sure, like yourself, I keep on learning about the subject, though we are very passionate about it. I've tried to learn more in my previous studies or in the writings. And because of the time that we have, I hope I can share some possibilities with you. And I'm convinced you can add many, many more aspects to the list. But again, I really hope and pray this will be beneficial to us all. Would that be okay?
Yes.
Even if you said no, this is what I had prepared. So now we must avoid generalizations, but I think it's right to observe that communication in our church gatherings or Bible study groups across the world, including Europe, is mostly oriented to Christians. Generally, our communication in such gatherings do not communicate adequately with non-Christians who might be present in the meeting. And many Christians do not feel stirred to invite unbelievers to hear the message of the meeting or the Bible study or the church service that is taking place. And if unbelievers attend, possibly they will hear a message that sounds foreign to them. And many hold the common view that communication, teaching, or preaching, or other expressions of communication that take place in the church context, particularly over our Sundays, should be focused on the edification of Christians, whereas communication to non-Christians should occur in evangelistic or apologetic initiatives, events, campaigns. Even most of our homiletical or Christian communication literature in general emphasize this perception. I wonder if you agree with me. And I would argue that the habit of communicating exclusively to Christians in our gatherings can be seen in three ways. First, the way we prepare our messages. Few of us would have non-Christians in mind as we craft the message we want to communicate. And perhaps while studying, preparing for our message, few of us would consider questions such as, will unchristians or unbelievers, non-Christians, understand these affirmations? What sort of opposition would they raise to this truth that would require some apologetic argumentation? What cultural idols should I uncover and address when speaking about this biblical truth or writing about it? How should I introduce my topic so that I may capture everyone's attention, including those who have never heard biblical content or may not be interested in biblical teaching? What biblical or evangelical terminology will require translation, definition, or contextualization in order for everyone in the room, or my readers, or the audience present in that gathering or meeting, grasp what I'm intending to communicate? I also think that the content we present on such Christian gatherings, particularly our services or Bible studies, are generally geared at Christians only. We expect listeners, we already have a certain level of biblical knowledge and framework that will make the message intelligible to them. Even our starting point tends to be where committed Christians are, not where non-Christians might be. And this includes their lack of familiarity with the Bible, or level of interest, or even predisposition to obey the biblical mandate, needs, questions, life experiences, religious misconceptions. And I think also this habit of communicating exclusively with Christians is seen in the language that we often use. And most non-Christians, I'm sure in your context as well, such as mine, do not know what the Old or the New Testament mean, who Abraham or Moses were, what we mean by prophets or apostles, what we mean when we say, we hope you will be connected to this body, or why would we call each other brothers and sisters? And we seem to speak a foreign language to some of the people in our audience who have no church background in Europe today. And this, don't you agree, may often make them feel left out or lead them to experience that communication as an outside observer, though I am inside the room. Now, it is important to reiterate that the description I am giving relates mainly to our church gatherings, services, groups, or studies. This is not the case, however, in our evangelistic initiatives, literature, campaigns, social media videos. And I'm surely not questioning the God-given burden that as followers of Christ, many of us have to reach non-Christians. What I am underlining, despite my funny accent, is the general tendency we have to communicate only to Christians in our regular weekly gathering studies, services, however your tradition may describe those moments. And I think, therefore, this approach seems to highlight 4 divides in our contemporary communication in our church meetings. First, divide in the audience to whom we speak. And our message is either aimed at Christians or aimed at non-believers. And in general, the church gathering particularly is aimed at Christians only. The second divide is between preaching or communicating or teaching or writing the Bible and communicating Christ. And our task in those gatherings, meetings, services, studies seem to be we need to communicate the Bible to the people of God, teach scriptures to them. Whereas when we are out in the university or that podcast or that evangelistic article, then we are proclaiming Christ to the non-Christians. Christ and the Bible seem to be oftentimes a divide that we embrace in our communication. Thirdly, I would highlight a divide in the application of apologetics is often embraced in our Christian communication today. Many of us know the value of apologetics, the defense of our faith, and there is an increased interest in the general public in relation to apologetics, I presume even in your local context, as it happens to mine, and particularly among young people and students. However, I seem to observe, I wonder if you do too, that those application of apologetics take place in our apologetic initiatives, communication, evangelistic, outside the church life, but not inside the life of the church, including the messages, the teachings, the sermons we are communicating. There seems to be a gap between the relevant apologetic content communicated outside the church gathering and its absence in our weekly gatherings. And fourthly, I would highlight, I think, a dichotomy that is related to the contextualization of the message we communicate. And there is a set of language, terms, presuppositions that are used in our Sunday or Thursday Bible study, gathering, meeting, service, and a very different set in our evangelistic or apologetic talks, even in our personal conversations with others. And though deeply rooted in our culture as a church or as Christians in general, I think these divides produce an incomplete approach to Christian communication. I think it falls short of the potential connection we all have with non-Christians that are present in our meetings and services and initiatives. I think it lacks, though it's very common, a missional perspective, and perhaps even creating a cycle. The communicator does not expect the presence or the reading or the listening of non-Christians. Therefore, we do not communicate with them, and therefore we do not reach them, and therefore the Christians that are exposed to our content are not inspired to invite their non-Christians to be present or to listen to your talk or your article or read your article later on internet. And there is a closed cycle that seems to feed this system of communication oriented to Christians only. I believe that, and suggest only, by eliminating each of these apparent dichotomies, we may offer a four-part model of communication. You can add many other parts. allow me to please and humbly suggest, if helpful to you, 4 parts to a model of communication, either through teaching, preaching, songwriting, social media, particularly though when we gather as a church. The first part is the inclusion of both Christians and non-Christians as our audience. We are building a bridge in our audience. Secondly, we build a bridge in our Bible interpretation, in our hermeneutics. And I would like to suggest a Christ-centered hermeneutics. We communicate the Bible and Christ always. It is not one or the other. Thirdly, apologetics should be included in our church communication, in our gatherings, articles, or other contents that we are producing. And in fourth place, an intentional contextualization of those messages so that unbelievers across Europe will identify with the message and see its relevance when we are communicating not anything, but biblical content. And that's crucial and key to our conversation. How can we best, more effectively, communicate biblical content to non-Christians as well? Now, those 4 parts are interconnected, but not dependent on each other. And I would like to camp with you in the following minutes in each of these parts. Okay? I do think that the application of any of these parts will make our communication more missional as we seek to communicate biblical content to non-Christians in Spain, France, in the UK, and across Europe. Now, can I just say, I'm not stressing or proposing an approach to sermons, teachings that is only communicating with non-Christians. Well, that would characterize an evangelistic communication, which is important and has its place. What I'm inviting us to consider is a communication that is speaking to both audiences, that will be deep and relevant as we share biblical content with all who might be present. Therefore, I hope that this conversation and the application of some of these ideas will cause us to bring to our different contexts a more missional approach to our biblical communication. So first part, if you allow me, is to invite us to consider the expansion of our audience as we communicate with both Christians and non-Christians. There is a very interesting passage that Conrad mentioned this morning. And actually, this is probably the earliest window to some aspects of the church gathering that is given in the New Testament. Written by Paul in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 23-25. And he writes, let me quote Paul here. So, if the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues, and inquirers or unbelievers come in, will they not say that you are out of your mind? But if an unbeliever or an inquirer comes in while everyone is prophesying, they are convicted of sin and are brought under judgment by all, as the secrets of their hearts are laid bare. So they will fall down and worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you. Amen. Now, Paul mentions 2 groups of people here that in addition to believers, are you all with me? Yeah. Yes. Back there? Would you mind waking him up, please? I'm joking. No. 2 groups of people that in addition to believers may be present in the church gathering. Again, this is the first window, historically speaking, that we have to a church gathering in the writings of the New Testament. And Paul says, in addition to believers, you may be having around you inquirers, in the Greek idiotes, and unbelievers, in the Greek apistos. And what is mainly of interest in our examination is the clear reference to unbelievers, apistos, attending the church meeting, Paul is saying. The term is found 23 times in the New Testament in reference to those who were not Christians. So this passage is revealing the fact that the early church did in fact expect the presence of non-believers in their gatherings. And Paul reveals his concern that the message communicated in the meeting must not be exclusively oriented to Christians. It must also appeal and reach the unbelievers that might show up in the meeting. Now, it is vital to recognize that we do not have a prescriptive body of New Testament teachings regarding the liturgy of a church gathering or service, much less how the teaching, the sermon, or other messages should be communicating during the gathering or the service with believers, and even if they had sermons on a weekly basis, for example. There is simply, as you may know, no biblical source to build a normative communication approach that affirms that our weekly church gathering or service or Bible study meetings must communicate with Christians only. Now, we may embrace such tradition, but we cannot affirm it is commanded in the New Testament. I'm not saying that the New Testament does not describe the activity of preaching, communication, and teaching. It does, primarily in the New Testament, in the book of Acts and the Gospels, revealing to us how Jesus would communicate. However, those are descriptions of communication outside church gatherings and exclusively to non-Christians, as in the case of Acts. Therefore, we do not have one single example of a sermon in a church service in the New Testament. We have preaching outside. The book of Hebrews might be a sermon, and the only sermon that we have written to both Christians and non-Christians. Paul is describing as the meeting, but not the teaching. Therefore, we may build our traditions, as we have done so, even within evangelicalism. Another thing, however, is to say, this is how it must be done. If there is no prescription in the New Testament, well, as in church government, there is freedom for us to rethink how we do what we do. And I suggest our teaching, our preaching, and our communication. Besides giving us some biblical foundation, allow me to highlight that church history even emphasizes this thinking. This I find quite interesting. The first 3 recorded post-apostolic sermons in church history are these. So after the apostles, these are the earliest sermons we know about. First, 2nd Clement, early 2nd century. Peripasca, second half of the 2nd century, by Melito of Sardis, and Quis Dives Salvetur, late 2nd or early 3rd century, by Clement of Alexandria. This is fascinating, I think. In all 3 messages, the preachers, in this case, address both Christians and non-Christians. You can look it up on Google and find those sermons. Interestingly, all of them were preached at a Christian gathering, and some parts of the message of the sermon communicated mainly with believers, and others to unbelievers. So both biblical foundation and church history invites us to consider there is no dichotomy necessarily. Can we build a bridge and communicate biblical content effectively to both Christians and non-Christians? Secondly, may I invite you to consider expanding our biblical interpretation, our hermeneutics, and therefore we communicate both the Bible and Christ always. As the audience is expanded to include both Christians and non-Christians, now the content is expanded to include Christ from whatever passage we may be communicating from. Granada defines communicating or preaching Christ in this case as communicating messages that authentically integrate the message of the text with the climax of God's revelation in the person, the work, and or the teaching of Jesus Christ as revealed in the New Testament. Now, it's not my intention to make a defense of Christ-centered hermeneutics as the only right way of interpreting the Bible. Personally, it is my understanding that the Bible should always be interpreted through Christ. It's the glasses we wear as we read Scriptures. And we should communicate with believers and non-believers on a weekly basis as we preach, communicate, write about, create content or songs to Christians and non-Christians from whatever passage we are inspired by. Luke 24:27 is an interesting passage where Dr. Luke reminds us that Jesus himself mentioned that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And then he says, "And everything must be fulfilled that is written about me," Christ saying these words, "in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. And commenting on the application of Christ-centered hermeneutics, as Ed Stetzer writes the following: "We should respect the original author's intent when writing under God's inspiration that passage, focusing on the passage at hand as it is, before broadening our view to see how the passage fits into the overarching story of God. It is important that we do both. See what the original author is doing, and then look to see how the Spirit more fully invests a passage with layers of application and significance in light of Christ's coming." There are several ways we can interpret the Bible through a Christ-centered hermeneutics. Once we've seen the definition, some biblical foundation, we see there is some church history application, as the 3 first sermons I mentioned to you are Christ-centered in their understanding of Scriptures. And as we try to apply it, can I just share with you 7 ways we can do so? We don't have time to go deep into them, but this is a conversation we can continue to have as we bridge the content and we preach, communicate, write, teach Christ from Scriptures, both end. And we do so, for example, through a redemptive historical progression. If we are communicating from the life of Samson and we make a connection to Christ, understanding that the big picture of Scriptures in creation has its climax in Christ and affects how God is dealing with His church and world history, culminating in the new creation. So how is this passage applying and speaking to the first readers, but what is it communicating to us today in light of Christ's coming? If I, for example, am communicating from a psalm that is begging God, "Do not allow your presence to leave me," I will, through my Christ-centered hermeneutics, understand this is not a prayer I would pray today, because the Spirit of God, now, because of what Christ has done, is not going to leave me. His presence is in me. So it is the same God, however, understanding the different moments of history because of what Christ has done. We can move on. Allow me to be a bit more quickly here by understanding the promise fulfillment of several Old Testament passages fulfilled in Christ, or to be fulfilled plainly in His second coming. We can think of typology, numerous characters of the Old Testament function in one way or the other as types of Christ. Adam, Abel, Seth, Enoch, Noah, Aaron, Joshua, and the list goes on. Or even objects, animals, institutions, events serve as types of Christ and his activity. And many, by the way, are very explicit in the New Testament, others are not. We may use analogy to identify that Christ-centered interpretation of scriptures. When, for example, we read Psalm 23:1 that says, "The Lord is my shepherd," and in Christ, who himself said, "I am the good shepherd," we make the analogies and understand how is this text more fully understood in light of the life, the work, the message of Christ. Longitudinal themes is also a very stimulating conversation here, but it's a technical term, but there are themes that can be traced throughout the Bible, from the Old Testament to the New: kingdom, law, temple, God's people. We have New Testament references to the Old Testament that clearly show us how we should interpret that particular passage. We can think of contrasts as well, as I've mentioned a couple of minutes ago, whereas the Old Testament will speak of entering God's presence, Psalm 24-95, or fear of being cast out of his presence, Psalm 51. The New Testament theology in this matter is different, because we are not going to enter God's presence. We now live in God's presence by his Spirit in us because of what Christ has done. So we understand the passage, but it grasps fuller meaning in light of what Christ has done. Are you still with me? Awake? Third place, allow me to suggest an approach to our missional communication where we apply apologetics to our messages for our services and other gatherings. If it is important for us to do so outside the life of the church, why not include apologetics in our teaching, in our writing, in our Bible studies, in our sermons, in our songs, in our social media content? And I suggest we revise this common divide and continue to do so outside the church, but also inside our church life. John Guest, I think, makes a strong case for the recovery of apologetics in church life, particularly in preaching. Just a parenthesis here, I presume most of us are familiar with the terminology of apologetics as giving reasons for our faith. I like the metaphor of a soil with several rocks where you want to plant through a seed, a plant that will grow, but unless you remove the rocks, the seed will not fall into an appropriate soil. Apologetics, in a way, is identifying the rocks of our culture, of the people we are communicating with, and dealing with those rocks so that the seed of God's word may fall into a more appropriate soil. There are different rocks in different contexts, in different cultures, but the initiative is the same. And again, John Guest says, the church must never forsake her high, urgent calling to engage in apologetics. Whatever the role of para-church organizations or ministries, and God has blessed them with a great fruit, a full orbit witness requires a gathering of believers, for only in the church can all of God's designs for believers find fruition. It is in the experience of worship that the relational and rational aspects of the Christian meet. There, Guest writes, the unbeliever inquirer sees what faith looks like up and close and lived out. Congregational life provides the habitat for faith and the heartbeat to our work of giving a reason for the hope that we have. And J.P. Moreland agrees. and identifies a few reasons why the Christian community should engage in apologetics within its communication. Sermons, poems, articles, songs. First, he says, Scripture commands it. Second, apologetics can help revoke obstacles to faith and thus aid unbelievers in embracing the gospel. Third, apologetics can strengthen believers in at least two ways. One way is it gives them confidence that their faith is true and reasonable. Apologetics is important for us believers. And also, he says, apologetics encourages a life of faith, seeking understanding. And it actually encourages spiritual growth. And finally, according to Dr. Moreland, apologetics can contribute to health in the culture at large. And I would say another important reason for applying apologetics to our communication of biblical content within the life of the church is that Christians will learn how to provide a defense for their faith in their daily lives. By listening to the communicators, by reading those who are communicating biblical content, they will also learn how to remove the rocks from their friends' hearts and minds at the gym, at the college, at the office, at the bar they go to, or the coffee shop, and will become more equipped to do the same in their daily interactions with non-believers. Finally, allow me to quote Peter Grant, who says, "From what we know of the early church, it is abundantly clear that apologetics was at the heart of their ministry as witness. The New Testament church leaders went about their mission as they argued with, discussed with, persuaded, and convinced their hearers in the synagogue or the marketplace." And finally, allow me to invite us to consider expanding our contextualization. Once we expand the content, the audience, and we expand the content, we expand the use of apologetics, we also expand our contextualization in order to speak and communicate with non-Christians. A set of language, terms, and references are considered. So, what do we mean by contextualization? By the way, at a basic level, it is the process of placing something into context, the adaptation of a certain culture. And we can see it throughout the pages of Scriptures. And I think the greatest example of contextualization we have is Jesus Christ himself. God contextualized. He became a human being and spoke our language and dressed up as we do and felt what we do. In this cosmic contextualization, God reached us and communicated with us. And continues to call us to contextualize His eternal message to our finite culture and context and towns and cities and marketplace and places of mission across Europe. I find an interesting example to be Paul's missionary sermons in the book of Acts. Acts 13, 14, 17. He's communicating the same gospel in various different ways depending on the audience. Graham Johnson wrote that biblical communication to a postmodern culture and even post-Christian culture and very secularized culture in several places of Europe should be approached in the same way that a missionary goes into a foreign culture. My wife and I are originally from Brazil. I happen to have an Italian nationality. My great-grandparents emigrated from Italy and Spain to Brazil during difficult times in Europe. My wife and I now have been living in Europe for 16 years. I also lived my teenage years in Mexico, but 13 years ago, when we moved to Spain, I had to adapt my Spanish, my way of thinking, in order to relate to the culture, become one of them, and serve to the best of our capacities that culture that God had called us to love and serve. It's no different to us today. As we look around our cities and towns in Europe, We think as missionaries because we are all, of course, on a mission. Every Christian is a human being on a mission. And Luke tells us in Acts 17 that when Paul arrives in Athens and in Europe in a context that is not, sadly, too different to many of our contexts, no biblical framework, polytheistic in so many ways, as we are today as well. He says in verse 17 that Paul, day by day, reasoned with those in the synagogue and also in the marketplace. This is translated by dialego. The Greek word dialego is translated to the word in English reasoned, not preached, to dispute, to reason, to discuss, to argue. He was, before being invited to preach, dialoguing, listening to, communicating with the culture. And after he was listening and learning, he was invited to preach. Actually, Luke is very intentional. He says, verse 16 of Acts 17, Paul saw the city. Verse 17, Paul dialogued. Verse 23, Paul walked around the city. Verse 23, he looked carefully to the Athenians, objects of worship. Then 28, he quoted Greek poets. How many times does Paul quote the Old Testament in Acts 17? The second most studied speech in history, perhaps after Jesus' Sermon on the Mount? None. He quotes at least twice Greek poets. How many times does Paul quote the Old Testament in Acts 13 in the synagogue? Many times. However, in Acts 17, his content was very clearly built in the Old Testament. He's not quoting it, though. What is he doing? He's contextualizing. He begins where people are. I've been walking around, and I notice you are very religious people. You actually have an altar to the unknown God. Well, the God that is unknown to you actually happens to be known to me. Let me tell you about this God. And then Paul gives us a marvelous example of contextualization as he announces God to a culture that had no notion of the biblical God or scriptures. He is double listening. I had a professor in seminary who told us, he was from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and he used to drive, and there was a big sign saying, Jesus is the answer. One day, however, he was driving through the same sign, and someone had written on top with a graffiti, what is the question? Of course, we know the answer, but what are the questions of our cultures in Europe today? What Netflix series are they watching? What TikTok videos are they watching? Who is influencing them? What are their dilemmas and dreams? And Paul listened, learned, and humbly connected to the culture to the point he quotes Greek poets and adapts their view to the truth view. For example, we know that verse 17:28, in him we live and move and have our being. What a wonderful truth. Actually, he's quoting a Greek poet who wrote Epimenides the Cretan about Zeus, the main God, for in thee we live and move and have our being. What is Paul doing? What you wrote about Zeus actually is true about the unknown God to you, the God that I'm communicating. And he doesn't begin with Jesus' love, death, and resurrection. He begins further back in his understanding that he needed to contextualize his message as he seeks to communicate biblical truth to non-Christians. And he does so, again, in verse 28, for we too are his offspring. He's here quoting the poem Phaenomena, one of the most widely read poems in the ancient world. Why does he do it? We all love what he then wrote in 1 Corinthians 9. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. And I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing. As going back to the story I was telling you, when my brother and I come to this swimming pool and we see the boy was drowning, I thought to myself, it is a bit chilly, cold. If I jump in the pool, I might get ill. Or I thought to myself, I remember my grandmother used to tell me, if you eat and swim, you can die. So I thought to myself, it is better that one die than two of us die. Or it is his fault. He doesn't know how to swim. Why is he trying to do so? What would you think of me? You must be crazy. Yes. So what really happened is that my other brother jumped in the pool, very deep pool. I reached to the ladder to the most that I could, and I was able to reach them, and we got the boy out of the swimming pool. And then his mom came to thank us and gave us 20,000 euros. He came to thank us, but the money was only a dream, okay? But that became to me a picture of what contextualization and the heart of our conversation here is about. There is a world and a culture drowning without the love, the truth, and the salvation of Christ. And Paul is jumping in the pool in Athens, seeking to save those that he could by the proclamation of God's message. And we are called to do the same. Not to analyze the culture only, or observe the 10 reasons why people are drowning. We are called to jump and do something about it as we proclaim God's truth to non-Christians. And we do so contextualizing the message, because this is the day that God called you and I to communicate His truth. And you are in the place where God wants you to do so, which is a very different context from other contexts around the world or even in history. And as some may say, God may have His best players in the most difficult matches. Let's be encouraged by that. Allow me to conclude just recommending, which I find helpful, some recommendations and practical ways of contextualizing. First, let us use in our teaching and sermons and poems and songs and social media content an accessible and well-explained vocabulary. Doesn't mean we abandon biblical terms. Of course we don't. But such terms need to be translated and given synonyms however possible. For example, instead of only saying the Gospel of John, I may want to say the biography of Jesus according to John, or the accounts of the life and the work of Jesus described by a good friend and biographer called John. And then later in my message, I may just say the Gospel of John. But I want to make sure that Daniel, a friend of mine who has no biblical framework, will hear me saying the Gospel of John, and he will understand what I mean by that. And our vocabulary is clear, and it is including the people who are reading what we write or hearing what we talk about. Or for example, the psalmist. Who are the psalmists? Well, they are songwriters. They are poets. So a songwriter, a poet, we call them psalmists in the Bible, called David. Then whenever I go back to the term in my message, I don't have to define it again. I have done so. Like Paul was taking people by the hand from the beginning of his message at the Areopagus, by the way, where ideas and philosophies were discussed, and we are called to the Areopagus of our cultures and days. He is deep. He is deep. But he begins where people are. He takes them by the hands, and he will take them where they need to go, all the way, never letting them go. One way to do so is to translate our vocabulary, make it accessible. Or New Testament. People don't know what the New Testament is, or the second part of the Bible, what was written after the life. And I'm defining the prophets. Who are the prophets? What do people think today when we say prophets? I explain that. And I suggest we give additional layers of background and context to the biblical content that we are communicating as well. We don't expect they will know what we are talking about. Okay? Can I quickly show you? I found it helpful. Don't know you can see this well. Professor Engel, decades ago, produced what we call the Engel scale, trying to describe the spiritual journey of people. When he said, we oftentimes think people are in the, let's say, -1, and then they are ready to cross the line of salvation to the 1. But actually, people are in different places across the spiritual spectrum. -1, -2, -4, -5 is a negative, positive attitude to the gospel, no God framework. And you can go further back. And Paul, in Acts 17, understands that his audience is much further back than his audience, for example, in Acts 13. But what I think often happens is we in Europe today speak like Acts 13 to an audience that is much more the audience of Acts 17. Thinking that people are where we would like them to be, but they are further back. What would it mean in my sermon, in my message, in my article, in my Bible study, in my podcast, in my however way I'm communicating biblical truth? Begin further back, where people actually are. Take them by the hand and guide them in a deep and meaningful way to where they need to go. Suggest we always consider an introduction that engages with the whole audience, and special attention must be given to unbelievers or those who are not interested in the biblical content we are about to give. Let's not take for granted. Let's cause interest. Let's begin as Paul did where people are. Also, may I suggest we openly acknowledge those in the audience or to whom we are writing that may not be Christians. This is my way of communicating, but every time I'm speaking or preaching at a church gathering, for example, I will say, welcome everyone, or you may be here and you do not believe necessarily in what you are hearing we are singing about or in the existence of God. How wonderful that you're here with us. Or at one point of the message, I may say, if you are a follower of Christ, then this is, you may not be a follower of, or even you may struggle with this truth. This might, you acknowledge, I suggest, their presence. We embrace them and say what you think or what you believe or what you do not believe is important to me as I'm communicating biblical truth to you. And we are open, we are intentional, we are celebrating their presence, and I hope encouraging our people to say, oh, this is a place I want my friends to be. This is a message I want to send on Tuesday to my coworker to listen to, because he's talking to me, but he's talking to her as well. I would like to suggest we also communicate biblical authority inductively. Deductively is to say, the Bible says, therefore, the Bible says has authority for a culture to which the biblical framework is relevant and trust the authority of the Bible. Paul is not saying the Bible says in his speech in Athens because the Bible didn't mean one thing for his audience. But to communicate biblical authority inductively is to show how real life and truth and reality connects to the ultimate reality. As Dr. Sunukian, my tutor in the doctorate, wrote, while it's accurate to say something is true because it is in the Bible, it is even more accurate to say something is in the Bible because it is true. And for a culture that has no biblical framework, what would it look like to show how relationships and dreams and fears and business and finances and environment connect to the ultimate reality. And it is in the Bible because it is true. And it is not only true because it is in the Bible. Are you with me? Finally, I would like to suggest, it may sound obvious, that we use influential cultural authorities to strengthen and illustrate key points. Paul is doing so in Acts 17. He's quoting their poets, their celebrities, their authorities to illustrate the key points. What would it mean for you and for me to make the right connections? And certainly, we may quote John Wesley, and wonderful. But what if we mostly quote people that people know about, relate to their culture? And particularly as we speak to non-Christians, who are they listening to? The arts and movies and sports and culture in general. We show how the biblical truth connects with them. There is one of my favorite songwriters and singers. Is a Spanish called Alejandro Sanz. And he's extremely popular. Many of you would know him. And there is one song which I have used on a number of occasions where I won't sing, okay, but he says something like, to the first person that takes me out of this hell that I live, to the first person that takes me to the truth, to the first person that doesn't judge me, a la primera persona. So people from Spain who would know this song. And he's speaking of a woman that would bring that to his life. Well, I might connect that truth and say, what a human thing to say. I am looking for someone who doesn't judge me. I am looking for someone. He's singing to the whole country his inner desire. Well, there is no woman, no man that can fulfill that inner human desire. But they are fulfilled in Christ. And he is singing about my cry. And now Paul was doing that. He is not only confronting the culture. Paul is connecting and confronting. He connects and he confronts. That is a good way of going about apologetics as we recognize our culture. The desires, the dreams of our people around us. And we humbly listen to it. We acknowledge it. And we celebrate those aspects that are positive about the culture. And then we build the right bridges also to influential cultural authorities to strengthen our point, to illustrate key points and show it is God's word, not only for them, but for you here in Madrid today, or for you in Paris, or in London, or in Prague today. Therefore, allow me to suggest us to quickly review, as we identified these four divides in contemporary Christian communication. And I've suggested we try to build, not on tradition necessarily, but on biblical foundation. And therefore, we communicate to both Christians and non-Christians from the same message. We communicate the Bible in Christ in every message, including the sermons and the teachings. We include apologetics in our church life and message, and we contextualize our message so that non-Christians will be identified with the message as we seek to communicate missionally God's word in a deep, profound, and relevant way under His anointing and grace and wisdom to both Christians and non-Christians, always.